The voice of the UK. This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
What I want to talk about is ADHD, and that's because of a listener who got in touch called Chris. Now, Chris wanted to draw my attention to a debate that's happening in Westminster next week, looking at access to diagnosis for people with the condition. Research by the ADHD Foundation and Psychiatry UK shows the number of UK adults seeking a diagnosis of ADHD has increased by 400% since 2020. Just in the last couple of weeks, Johnny Vegas, Sue Perkins and Jermaine Pennant have all revealed they've got ADHD. Later on, we'll be speaking to the chef, Gizzy Erskine, about her ADHD diagnosis 15 years ago. But as always, I want to hear from you. Have you or someone you love had a recent diagnosis? Do you suspect that you may have ADHD, but perhaps too nervous to find out? Or perhaps you think, look, yes, it's just part of the makeup of who I am. It hasn't got in the way of how I wish to live my life. Therefore, I'm quite happy not to have that diagnosis. But it may also be the other way, where it will answer a lot of questions for you, provide guidance, help and support to allow you to live a life perhaps you haven't been able to live thus far. We're going to be talking about what it means that some of us might have it but don't know. So with me to kick us off this hour is that very listener, Chris Healey. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hiya. I've got to say thank you to you and your team for the thorough planning you've obviously put into this feature for the next hour. It really exceeds far what I expected or even hoped for when I first contacted you. So I really want to thank you for that first.
So Chris, there's a great team here at Five Live, so thank you for that. Tell me why you got in touch in the first place, Chris.
I don't know quite where to start. I'll tell you a little bit about the journey I've been on with my own diagnosis and where I've got to now, if that's all right.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I've come to terms almost calling it a little bit of a breakdown. It was the first time I took time off work for 2 months for stress, and I was working in education at the time. At that point, it coincided with me starting a divorce. My wife told me she didn't love me, etc. And I revisited, having waited for 2 years with no contact from my NHS provider since referral from my GP. I decided to have to borrow some money to be able to do it privately and get diagnosed, which I did. I've since realized that my condition really was not very appropriate to be working within a secondary school in a city classroom teaching English, because really time management, all this sort of thing, the free periods I would have to usually deal with, say, a fight outside in the classroom or some other distraction, which meant that I was working such long hours at home, becoming a bit of a workaholic. And as I learned about my ADHD, I decided to move into a new career. My career ended within teaching, and I decided to try and become a coach for adults with ADHD, because the more I learned about it, that I wasn't told in my diagnosis or by any medical professional after diagnosis, was so crucial to understanding myself and being able to then start to self-manage as best I can, the difference I have neurologically. I then contacted you because at this time I thought, well, I'll try and be helping people that are in crisis like I was. And I kind of realized the chances of them having the financial ability to pay for coaching, because coaching isn't provided by the NHS for anyone with any ADHD, or to even just feel that it would work because they would feel so overwhelmed at these crises points, meant that actually my whole model for who I was trying to help wouldn't work. And at that point I thought, well, I don't want to put my knowledge or learning about ADHD to waste. I have information that I know will help others. So I thought I would put my efforts, because creativity is quite a good part of ADHD. It makes you very creative.
Right.
I put all of my efforts into campaigning to try and get some change in this country.
Okay, Chris, just give us a definition of what this debate will entail in Westminster next week.
Well, it's going to be in Westminster Hall, and I'm not 100% sure, but it's being brought by MP Elliot Colburn from, I think, Carshalton Wallington constituency. And it's based around both the petition, mainly about two petitions before the petition I started about it. And it's about increasing funding and access to diagnosis for ADHD and for ASD. But I'm specifically here about ADHD because there has been, in 2009, there was an Autism Act, and there is a national strategy for autism, which came in, I think, about 3 years ago. But there's nothing in place for ADHD, and adult ADHD is extremely debilitating if undiagnosed.
How did you get diagnosed, Chris?
I had to, like I said, borrow money to go privately to get diagnosed. And that involved, back then, it was about £1,200 for the diagnosis assessment. That assessment was actually 1 hour long. And nowadays probably happens online, not even going in. And because of, obviously there's a shortage, I guess, of these consultant psychiatrists, that means the waiting list has rocketed up, and the price by supply and demand has rocketed as well. The same person now would have charged me £2,400 for that 1 hour assessment diagnosis.
1 hour, 2,400, my God.
Yeah.
Okay, what are the dangers of not being diagnosed, Chris?
Okay, so people that are undiagnosed with ADHD compared to neurotypical folk, as it were, they have a much higher, statistically much higher at risk of divorce, car accidents, unemployment, drug addiction, criminal convictions, alcoholism, financial chaos, debt, and tragically suicide. All of those things are risks to people that haven't been diagnosed. And if you imagine,
but that could be, just to be clear, that could also be a number of issues conflating. So there could be ADHD, anxiety, depression, all of those things.
Actually, if I can be honest there, actually, I think that's actually, it could be. I'm not a medical professional, and I'm sure that you can speak to someone
we will
that
be,
is.
yeah, we will be, yeah.
But from what I've read, actually, frequently it's misdiagnosed. People are treated for anxiety or depression. And actually, that is not what their issue is. What their issue is that they have ADHD and they haven't been diagnosed with it yet. Because ADHD brings one major comorbidity, which it took me 2 years to discover about and is crucial, which is called RSD. That's rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's an emotional dysphoria that can really overwhelm. And when it hits, I call it like a spiral. It's crippling, and it brings all the shame, self-criticism, blame, feeling abnormal and feeling hopeless. And that, if you imagine with ADHD, you then ruminate on that and you go into, as I call it, a spiral, like a whirlpool of real emotional disintegration. Obviously, that doesn't happen to everyone or all the time. But if you don't know about that, you just know the experience, and therefore you believe this self-criticism. So without a diagnosis, you'll be out there thinking, I just am an abnormal adult, I can't function properly, I'm a failure, and all that shame comes in. If that makes any sense?
Indeed, it does. Chris, let's stay there for a second. Let's bring in now Professor Philip Asherson, who is a psychiatrist at King's College London and has published more than 300 papers on ADHD. So it's great that we have Professor Asherson with us. Good afternoon, Professor.
Hi, good afternoon.
Can you give us your expert opinion on the consequences of a lack of diagnosis or indeed a misdiagnosis?
Well, I think for a long time ADHD was thought of as a childhood-only condition. And what was being missed was that the symptoms and the syndrome quite frequently persists into adult life and often throughout adult life. And I think what was happening was that, at least for some people with ADHD, their symptoms, people could see there was a problem. So they'd go to their doctor and they'd see there was some kind of mental health issue or problem with functioning in daily life, but they wouldn't know about ADHD. So they would look at other types of symptoms they might be presenting with and think, well, this is probably anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder, or when severe, a personality disorder or a severe behavioral problem. So I think the lack of understanding of ADHD was often leading to people not being diagnosed, and in a way then not getting the right kind of help that they needed. So for many years, that's been the sort of main problem with that.
What are the factors, Professor, that have led to there being such an increase in people with ADHD?
Well, it's really an increase in the numbers being diagnosed and recognised. I mean, the prevalence itself appears to have been quite stable over many years, if you look at the research on that. But it was only in 2008 that in the UK, the NICE guidelines for the first time recognised that ADHD impacted on adults. And back then, there was about 4 NHS clinics. They were seeing 1 or 2 people a week or a month even, very low recognition rate. But then since that time, there's really been a very rapid increase in the number of clinics. So things have changed dramatically, and the recognition is so much greater than it was. It doesn't quite explain why during the pandemic, the rates have shot up. Although you could argue that's part of mental health generally, that the lockdowns really impacted on people. And I guess people with ADHD were particularly suffering from their lack of routine, their inability to stimulate themselves in the normal ways that help them function, and sort of being stuck at home without those kind of normal life sort of processes, I guess. So that did seem to really increase the referral rate. But it is interesting how it suddenly reached some kind of tipping point where it's so much more widely recognised now than it was even a few years ago.
So what are the symptoms of ADHD? If it's indeed a spectrum, then there must be varied symptoms.
Yeah, well, it's important to recognise it is a spectrum. So rather like the way I think of it is like somebody with a blood pressure problem or obesity, it does sort of blend into the normal range in that sense. But if you've got high levels of ADHD symptoms, there's a core problem with regulating your attention. So this means like you're being distracted by your internal thought processes, which are sort of spinning off onto sort of random things that are nothing to do with what you're trying to focus on. And it's very hard to sustain your attention for long. That has a huge impact on your memory, your ability to organize yourself, your ability to keep focused, to read, to enjoy a movie, to have a conversation with people if you're not really listening to them. And the other aspect of it can be things like being a bit impulsive, somewhat restless, feeling you have to be on the go all the time, never really being able to stop and relax, and sometimes not being able to control it. So maybe you butt in, you talk over people. So that can be a problem, but certainly not always. And the other thing which Chris referred to, which I think is really common and unrecognized, is the impact of emotion, what I call emotional dysregulation, sort of overreacting to things, not being able to regulate your emotional symptoms as well as other people, getting more frustrated, more irritable, just overreacting to things. And that can have a huge impact back on your mood as well. So many of these problems, because you're experiencing them every day of your life, it's not like anxiety or depression that tend to come and go in episodes, but it's something you're living with every day of your life. People put in a huge amount of effort to kind of try and manage this problem. And for some people, they can manage it, but often at a cost of feeling fatigued or exhausted. People with ADHD often don't sleep well at night. But for other people, it just leads to a lot of failures and problems, in their work, in their education, their ability to keep their relationships together. And then it can have a much wider impact. Of course, people with ADHD can develop and often do develop other co-occurring mental health issues. They may become anxious and depressed, but it could be that ADHD is underpinning the reasons, why they become anxious and depressed, for example.
Is there a default reaction to a diagnosis which involves medication, or are there other interventions that are talked about, Professor, that do not involve automatically placing someone with medication? Don't worry, Chris, I'll come back to you in a moment.
That's a good question. And the NICE guidelines themselves say that you should be thinking about what they call environmental modification. So that really means thinking about how you function best in your environment and trying to adapt your environment to your particular set of skills or abilities. And some people with ADHD are quite skillful at that, although they may still suffer from kind of more internalizing problems, like just being restless and not being able to sleep, not being able to relax, and so on. Sorry, I lost the gist of the question. Sorry.
Well, no, it's interesting because I've read before that there could be emotional issues at home, for instance, diet, high sugar diet, so then kind of peaks and troughs. So are they some of the environmental examples, perhaps, that NICE are looking at?
Right. Well, I think sort of learning about your ADHD, understanding it and learning how to manage it best in your daily life is what's recommended. And that seems to be very important for people. So if you can find a good and qualified ADHD expert to guide you in your life, that can be really helpful. But none of the other forms of treatments have really been shown to be effective in most people, and so NICE don't recommend thinking a lot about your I mean, there are no specific treatments in terms of avoiding particular items in your diet. You know, there's some evidence that essential oils or fatty acids can help your ADHD a little bit. There probably are things that will make some people's ADHD worse, like you might get a sugar rush or certain additives. It has been shown that certain additives can increase your ADHD, but they probably don't cause it. So I think each individual may find that they're a bit more sensitive to certain things than others. Where I think the environment is important is more in terms of the outcome, you know, particularly if during your childhood you have ADHD and you get a lot of negative critical feedback as a child, and maybe you're not doing well or failing or finding it hard to form relationships. I mean, of course, that can have a huge detrimental impact on you. Whereas people that do well with ADHD perhaps are more likely to be exposed to a kind of very sort of enriched or sort of nurturing environment and given a lot of positive feedback, and their strengths are built upon rather than highlighting their weaknesses. I mean, I think these things have a huge impact on people.
That's fascinating. That's actually very fascinating. Chris, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I want to say, I don't want us to focus. There is a huge, like the professor just said, that there is a huge necessity for this, and there can be lots of very negative impacts. But I think it's important to say that even the term ADHD is, as a term, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is almost quite misleading, and particularly the disorder part, I genuinely feel, because I heard this yesterday speaking to another professional within the field, that they mentioned a quote they'd heard off adult ADHD podcasts, where they explained that in some ways it's only really a disorder mainly if you're undiagnosed or you haven't started to fully understand how it affects you, because there are lots of really positive traits that can come with ADHD, as Dr. Halliwell in the US calls it, gifts you can unwrap, like, you know, being great in a crisis, creativity, like very often very creative people. If you can get into, if you are a creative person with ADHD, you find that you can get into such a flow state. I mean, I produce music as well. So when I'm in the studio, I can go without meals, but that will lead to burnout eventually. But I can be there for hours and hours. And I think that's what makes me be able to be skilled in production, is I can have the same loop going round and round and just be adjusting it. But there's also hyper focus, which is part of that. You know, there's also a lot of empathy, I think, with a lot of people with ADHD, and loyalty. So for employers and stuff out there, I think it's really important that information is provided. That was one of the things of our campaign, is that people need to be informed. I got no information once diagnosed. And it says in the NICE guidelines, families, like partners, and the patient should get thorough information about the condition. Without that, for me, more than anything, more than medication, knowledge is power. And again, to quote that Dr. Halliwell, he says, if you know yourself, it becomes easier to learn to like yourself. And I think that is so crucial, really.
Yeah, no,
And
I understand. I understand
and
that.
just on the support point,
Yes.
just that there are things that are currently suggesting that they may help, like diets, the other guest mentioned, and things like omega-3 acids. But exercise is really helpful for mental health, really helpful within neuroplasticity and helping. And therefore, why aren't people being told these things? Meditation, stuff like that. If these are things that people can make to lifestyle changes that can really help them, why has no GP ever suggested this to me, or no psychiatrist? And I just think those are the three things that are so worrying, that they're all in the NICE. Funnily enough, I wrote those 3 targets for my campaign and then found the NICE document, and it covers all 3 of them in its guidelines.
Right.
And yet they're not being done. And my worry is, if you think about the youngsters that are increasingly diagnosed in childhood, there is a tsunami of people that need diagnosis or some support or guidance coming through. And it seems a no-brainer to me that the human and financial cost to society of continuing to ignore and neglect this group of people and not give them any support is going to be immense, because all of those things I listed earlier affect other people: divorce, unemployment, whatever.
Indeed. Chris, can I just stop you there? Sorry,
yeah.
Can I just stop you there for a second? Because you mentioned children in there. And Professor, I just wanted to quote something from the BMJ that I was reading earlier on, where it said children labelled as having ADHD are perceived as lazier and less clever by peers and teachers, and parents have low academic expectations of them, potentially creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that backed up by the evidence?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think of ADHD as an attention regulation problem. So in a way, it's not really a deficit, but a regulation problem. So most people with ADHD can focus on things in the moment that are sufficiently stimulating or interesting. But it's quite a short-lived kind of ability to focus. So you may focus for long, or hyper-focus, as Chris said, on things that really stimulate you right now. That's why you get these great footballers with ADHD, but off the pitch, they're really falling apart in other aspects of their life.
Professor, if you expect
laziness, because it looks like you're not trying.
Right, if you accept that there is some truth in that or that description I just gave from the BMJ, then could that make parents reticent to seek a diagnosis because of the labelling, the negative labelling that is associated with the ADHD? Now, that's not to say they shouldn't, but how do we change perceptions to make sure that children who are labelled with having ADHD are not seen as being lazier and less clever?
I think this comes from a kind of history of thinking of ADHD as a behavioural problem, and particularly bad behaved boys were being diagnosed mainly. So the girls with ADHD, or people with mainly problems with their ability to focus, were often being missed. They were just the lazy ones that weren't trying at the back of the class. But I suppose the diagnosis is kind of leading you to the right kind of understanding and support that you need. So you're right, you want to kind of disengage a kind of negative sort of label, if you like. But in a way, it's not, the term itself is just describing a problem which is common and people commonly experienced. And as Chris said, there's so much you can learn about it and do. And the more you know, the more you can help yourself. So I think those were really important points that Chris made.
Indeed.
So, hopefully that will start to change. I mean, in general, in mental health, we have this problem, with anxiety and depression and everything else in mental health. So we really need to move on from that and start to realize that, these are genuine problems that people really need help with, much like anything else.
Thank you for all your texts that are coming in. It's unsurprising that so many adults are seeking a diagnosis. Our environment's become very pressured due to the cost of living crisis, rising inflation and COVID. Many people are cracking under pressure. But when you're already stressed through untreated ADHD, it's even worse. #ActuallyADHD in Leicestershire. Please keep your text coming in. 85058 is the text number. We're talking about adults being diagnosed or not diagnosed or misdiagnosed. ADHD is what we're looking at, and we would love to know your experiences, your thoughts about this. 08085 909 693 is the number.
BBC Radio 5 Live.
It's a great companion through the day.
I love listening to 5 Live because of the variety of opinions that I get to hear.
It really does keep me up to date.
The voice of the UK. Nihal Arthanayake. BBC Radio 5 Live.
We're talking about adult ADHD. Really, really interesting, says Matthew in Shetland, listening to conversations around ADHD. My son was diagnosed with ADHD and I've every reason to believe I have it too. So many of the traits apply to both my son and myself. This said, can we just be clear? ADHD isn't a mental illness. It's a disorder that can't be alleviated or cured in the way depression, anxiety, or even schizophrenia can be. Yes, it is psychiatric services that are expected to pick this up. We are stretched beyond belief and can only do so much. Without adequate resources, we won't be able to help anyone given the demands that are being placed on us. We have Professor Philip Acheson with us, who is a psychiatrist at King's College London, published more than 300 papers on ADHD. Clearly, Professor, that is a text from someone that works, is a medical professional such as yourself. What do you think of that text?
I think ADHD sort of sits on the borderline, if you like, between mental health and I guess it's a neurodiversity. You know, it's a set of abilities or disabilities. But it has its own particular profile. But I guess it's linked to psychiatry is because there are medical treatments. And those drug treatments, you know, really, when they work really well. And so a lot of people like to use these medications because it helps them function, it helps them focus. They often feel calmer, less restless. So it does resolve many of the sort of underlying kind of symptoms they're experiencing. So I think you can think of it in that way. And it's also overlapped so much with feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, that you often need a psychiatrist to help separate out ADHD from those other disorders and to kind of clarify that it is ADHD and not a kind of more conventional mental health problem, if you like. But I suppose psychiatry needs to deal with the broad spread of problems that people experience. I mean, it overlaps with psychology. I mean, really the main difference between psychology and psychiatry is run by doctors who give medications. Psychology is more about talking therapies. But of course, most people might need one or either or both of those treatments.
Chris, we will come back to you in a moment. We've got so many guests to come back to. The reason that Chris Healey is here, because he's a listener to 5 Live who brought this story to us, and we have then expanded upon it, the brilliant team here at 5 Live, to bring you a full hour committed to talking about ADHD. Hester Granger is an ADHD speaker and trainer who was diagnosed at 43 after finding out both her children had it. And Hester joins us now. Good afternoon, Hester.
Hi, Nihal. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for being part of this conversation today. How did you realise you might have ADHD, Hester?
I think like a lot of people in their 40s, their children get diagnosed, and that's what happened with me. So my children had been diagnosed as autistic first. Off the back of that, my husband noticed a lot of traits and worked out he was autistic and got officially diagnosed as well. Then it was actually during lockdown. So we were homeschooling the children, as everybody was, and struggling and trying to get them to do their work. And it was more around our son originally. And you'd repeat things and you'd say, right, now we're going to do this sum. And we talked him through it sort of 4 or 5 times. And he's super bright. Both children are. They're 11 and 13 and very, very intelligent. And it just wasn't going in. And we realised there might be something with the sort of around the processing. So we decided to get them both assessed because, as I'm sure Professor Philip sort of has talked about, you know, there's a lot of comorbidities where, you know, if you have ADHD, the chances are, there are chances that you could be autistic as well and vice versa. So we decided to get them both assessed. And it was during that diagnosis, actually, that the psychiatrist said, oh, and you've obviously got ADHD, have you? And I laughed and I said, no, I haven't. Why? And I just talk 100 miles an hour. I fidget a lot. I'm easily distracted. I'm very impulsive, all these things. And obviously they'd come across during the assessment, and then I just started going down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of finding out more and researching, and then got officially diagnosed at 43 a couple of years ago.
What difference did it make to your life?
Oh, so much difference. It was honestly life-changing. I think before I'd looked back. I feel, I'm really happy with my life. I'm happily married. We run a neurodiversity consultancy, Perfectly Autistic. Like, I feel like I've succeeded in life, so to speak. But it's been really, really hard. And looking back now, I think, my gosh, that's why I failed my maths GCSE 3 times. That's why I worked so hard. I got to uni, I was told not to go, I was told not to bother and just to go out and work and not worry about A-levels. Did my A-levels, didn't get great grades, but I've got A-levels, managed to get to uni. But everything's just been a bit of a struggle, sort of like walking through treacle. And now I know why I am the way I am. I know why I interrupt people, or I get really passionate, excited about certain topics. And that's because I've got ADHD. So I'm able to, as Professor Philip was saying, sort of adapt the environment and learn about my ADHD. And like you said, I'm a speaker and a trainer now, and I sort of hopefully empower other parents to do the same, and also adults who are ADHD themselves.
What impact did it have on relationships and jobs?
Yeah, well, so for relationships wise, my husband and I have been together for 21 years, and it's really interesting because neither of us knew that we were neurodivergent. And actually, quite often you find the more people you talk to, you're kind of quite often drawn to neurodivergent people. It's almost like a bit of a magnet. So we often joke that nobody else would put up with each other. I'm aware I'm quite full on and 100 miles an hour, but it's actually just made our relationship even better. And as a family, knowing that we've all got ADHD has honestly been life-changing, because we're all a lot more sympathetic to each other. As I said, the children and my husband are also autistic as well, so we're a sort of truly neurodivergent family. But it's just really made a difference where we've been able to learn so much about it, and really understand what works for us as a family.
Okay, what should people know about ADHD? I mean, it's such a big question because, as the professor pointed out, it's a spectrum, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as you say, that's a huge question. I think for me, around being a parent and the labelling aspect, which you picked up on earlier, there's such a stigma when you say, oh, my child's got ADHD, the label around that. But unfortunately, without a label in inverted commas, you can't get the support. And when we told the children's school that they both were being going to assess them for ADHD, the teachers were like, they haven't got ADHD, they sit still. They're compliant, were their words. They comply during lessons. Because, as you say, the stereotype is naughty boys throwing chairs across the classroom, like when you think of ADHD. And I think that's the problem. But I think with myself, I spent so long researching it and kept thinking, I haven't got ADHD. This is just the way I am. I'm not ADHD. And then when I got assessed officially by a psychiatrist, he said, you've got combined ADHD. So there are 3 types, hyperactive, inattentive, and also combined. So you're both, which makes a lot of sense for me. But I think just parents need to do their own research. And that's why we've got a free Facebook group, Perfectly ADHD, because like Chris said, you get handed your report and you're literally sent on your way. Like, you don't get any information. And I didn't know I had ADHD at the time. So my hyperfocus led me down all these rabbit holes around obviously autism originally and then ADHD. But I think don't be afraid to get your child diagnosed, or yourself. If you think you have ADHD and you're doing all these online tests and you're umming and ahhing, just know. And then you know once and for all.
Professor Asherson, what about support for people with ADHD? I read out that text, which was clearly from a medical professional that works in this field, and they were making it very, very clear that psychiatric services are expected to pick this up. We're stretched beyond belief and can only do so much.
Well, I think it's a massive problem. So people who are fortunate to have the money can go and get the treatments and the help they need and the psychological support they need. Of course, a lot of people with ADHD aren't managing money well and aren't in a position to afford the treatments. Actually, probably most people. And, NICE guidelines clearly talk about psychoeducation, not just medication, the need to think about your environment, to understand your ADHD and so on. But it's expensive to deliver. I mean, the other problem is just the lack of capacity. We know there are these huge waiting lists. So like people like Chris went privately, not because he necessarily wanted to, but otherwise he'd be waiting 2 or 3 years, perhaps longer. So yeah, it's hard to answer those things. We're trying to educate a broader range of doctors. I mean, your GP should know about this, especially now that we're beginning to understand it so much better. And all psychiatrists, and everyone working in mental health should know about these things. So when you're at school or college or university or even in the work setting, people with giving occupational support need to know about it. So I think, a very important aspect would just be broadening the knowledge and understanding among a wide range of professionals. We focus so much on anxiety and depression, we're missing out this really important common problem.
Professor Philip Asherson, thank you for joining us today. Psychiatrist at King's College London, published more than 300 papers on ADHD. Hester Granger, thank you to you as well for joining us. We have lots of guests on this, including the NHS doctor Max Davey, who's also the co-founder of ADHD UK. Max, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
How big is the pressure on the NHS for diagnosis of ADHD in adults? I mean, the professor there was saying it can be 2 to 3 years, even longer. Therefore, you could start off at year 6, year 7, and in the entirety of secondary school, you may not get a diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, it's unacceptable. Speaking as someone who's been in the NHS for 20 years, it's the situation, both for children and adults, is unacceptable in the amount of time and the harm that's done while people are waiting for diagnosis. And even within that, we don't actually know how long. We don't have good data for how long people are waiting in different places. So the situation is very bad.
So in that respect, then, how much are people paying to get this done? What is the range that people will have to pay if they want, if they have the means to go private?
Well, I think it very much varies, and I think that there's kind of quite a lively market in different forms of assessment. If you want to get an online assessment, then you could get that under £1,000. But if you want something more comprehensive, you can be spending thousands of pounds on an assessment. And then often one of the problems is you then have to for instance, if you go on to medical treatment, you then need to transition back into the NHS, and that can be quite tricky. You may need to spend more money on private prescriptions until the NHS can pick up supervising your care, and that's a puzzle in children particularly.
Can you tell us just how difficult, Dr. Davey, it is now? I mean, it seems, and we know this with CAMS, for instance, as well, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, how long parents are having to wait for that. Is there any difference in your age, or does it make no difference at all whether you're a school child or whether you're an adult?
I think the honest truth about that, and it may be that Professor Asherson knows better, but we as ADHD UK have been trying to get robust data on waiting lists across the ages and across the different areas of the country, and it's very, very difficult to get, and it's very difficult to get a proper picture. It's extraordinarily variable. In children, some areas have a just about acceptable waiting list of a few months. Others have gone up to that 2 or 3 year level. But of course, and Hester's just been alluding to the links with autism. What you really want is a neurodevelopmental assessment overall, which picks up the ADHD alongside the autism and the communication difficulties or coordination difficulties. And sometimes people are going around and round in circles, having multiple different assessments, and never quite getting to the bottom of things. And that is a process that can take years and years and years.
So what can be done? Because so often I have these conversations, and we are, quite rightly focused on what can't be done. But we need to provide a service to show that actually there are some mitigations, interventions, etc., that people can do if they are having to wait for months and sometimes years. Is there?
I think there are, because I think one of the things that I say to try and make people feel better if they're on my waiting list, for instance, is a lot of the stuff that you do with ADHD short of medication, and I'm speaking perhaps more about children, but in adults as well, a lot of the stuff that you can do, you don't need to wait for a doctor or a psychologist to tell you that you have a diagnosis. So working on your own mental state, you're dealing with your anxieties, which can make ADHD a huge amount worse, improving your sleep, making sure you get plenty of exercise, and then talking it's harder without a diagnosis in employment. But with schools, talking to the school, we're awaiting a diagnosis. We think, my child has got ADHD. What adjustments, what reasonable adjustments can you make to their needs? So there's quite a lot that you can do before you get a diagnosis, which isn't to defend the weights. I think they're indefensible, but it's not, all is not lost. You don't have to just sit on your hands waiting for a diagnosis before you can start doing stuff.
Dr. Max Davey, co-founder of ADHD UK, thank you very much indeed. Let's speak to Gizzy Erskine, who is a chef and food writer who was diagnosed with ADHD 15 years ago. Gizzy, good afternoon.
Hey, Noah, how are you?
Good. Thanks so much for coming on. Interesting. Okay, interesting in the... How does it help in the environment of a kitchen?
Oh, God. I mean, I really hate it when people refer to certain ADHD sort of elements as being a superpower. But I've got to say, in the kitchen, it's been one of the most incredible places for me where I can literally hyper-focus on one thing. I know exactly what I'm doing. And what you tend to find within kitchens is that you'll have several people who actually sit within the sort of ADHD spectrum. And everyone sort of seems to hone in on this sort of hyper-focused state, but can still run around like, mad things, achieving really brilliant sort of creative stuff. It's been really useful within my work. That said, that's really one of the very few places it is super useful. That's why I sort of get frustrated where people sort of really focus on the, which is a positive. Hyperfocus is a really positive side of it, the condition, but it's, a lot in my instance, I was very, very early adult diagnosis ADHD. I was 30, I think, when I got diagnosed, right. And I'm 43 now, and it was a real. I was 28 when I got diagnosed, and it was a real sort of unique proposition for a woman to be diagnosed with ADHD, for one, and one who was like, would have gone completely under the net, because I'm clearly very, very ADHD, but I think also, as a woman, and then I don't think anybody was really getting there was very few diagnoses for women in those days.
Okay, so, right, why did you go for the diagnosis in the first place?
I mean, I think all of the sort of archetypal things, I think the best way that I can describe it is when you sort of break down what ADHD stands for. It's, attention hyperactive deficit disorder. And it's like, and I just kind of fit, I'm a manic person. I run around like a headless chicken, but I'm also, I can get totally distracted as well. There's no, you can lose me. My mum, the first real sort of idea that there might have been a problem was when I was a child, and my mum would always say, you were so ethereal, we could stick you in a corner and you'd completely become in your own zone. You were in a zone, but it was your own zone. And then fast forward to all the archetypal cliches at school, where you would be, told that I could achieve. I was an underachiever, that I could, if I really put my mind to it and I really could focus, that I could achieve all this stuff. Never really had that support, but was still able to get through just about with like good grades. But I left school at 15. I was listening to you talking to another guest earlier. I never made it through the school system for there wasn't any support or help for someone like me. And so yeah.
How did your diagnosis, Gizzy, change your life?
Oh no, inexplicably. It was one of the best things to ever happen to me, because suddenly I was able to explain to other people what was wrong. I think there were always things that people sort of refer to as being, within ADHD, like being driven by a motor, or sometimes people would assume you were on drugs because you were just so blah, you couldn't stop your brain. My brain works so fast. But it was, so it was a really great thing for people to sort of understand all of my sort of weirdnesses, I guess.
And now, do you feel that, especially amongst women, there's a more open conversation about ADHD?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's brilliant. I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and I'm sort of so grateful that finally we're having all of these conversations. It's fantastic, especially for women. Because, I think one of your other guests said that the typical perception of ADHD was a sort of young boy running around classroom throwing things and And we now know that that isn't it. You know, even the other day, actually, I have a friend who was going for diagnosis and was told there's no way he could have ADHD because he got through school. But that's not the case at all. It turned out through another diagnosis that, of course, you know, he had all of the other, you know, so many other reasons which led to him having this diagnosis. So there's still quite a lot of, you know, shortcomings on what it actually means to be it's such a diverse condition. But I do feel slightly concerned as well that the volume of conversation is also, you know, one of the things that I find really alarming is social media and how it attacks it. You know, there are sort of influencers now that are dedicated just entirely to their ADHD, even intellectual sort of spaces which are sort of putting out memes daily that make people feel like they could be ADHD. I think there's a lot of sort of really unhelpful pushing of the diagnosis now on social media. So, and if you really go through that, the boxes to be ticked of what you're diagnosed when you get diagnosed, there are things that, you know, my mum can walk into a room and forget why she's there. You know, it's
right,
like
of course.
Things within that sort of box, the box being ticked, so that I think, you know, so many people can feel like they have the condition. And I worry now that there's a lot of people out there who believe that they have the condition because of it being drummed into them through these memes or these TikTok answers or even merch, you know.
I've seen it. Gizzy, sadly we've run out of time, but thank you so much for coming on the show.
Right.
Thank you.
The voice of the UK. This is BBC
We shall
Radio
continue
5
this conversation
Live.
just for a couple of minutes, that's all, after the news, which is brought to you now by Tim Daly.
BBC Radio 5 Live.
The voice of the UK. Nihal Arthanayake. Listen live, pause, rewind and discover with the BBC Sounds app.
We have the bona fide legend, all-round wonderful man that is George Takei waiting for us. And we will be speaking to George in about 3 or 4 minutes' time here on 5 Live. And he has been most gracious to give us an entire hour of his time. So we will definitely be getting to him in a few moments. But before that, let's go back to Chris, who is the reason we're having this conversation about ADHD for the first hour of the show. Chris Healey was a listener to 5 Live, is a listener to 5 Live, and got in contact with me, as you can do. You know, you can just tweet me. You can DM me directly on Instagram if you want to. My DMs are open there. And just say, look, there's something I really want to talk about. And, you know, that happens. And then we end up having an extraordinary hour of radio. Chris, just a last point. Any last points you would like to make?
Yeah, there are a couple of things I really wanted to say that were really clear. One, firstly, if it's okay, I want to mention just the name of the campaign that I've been running because we've got
very quickly, yeah, absolutely.
That's ADHD Flip the Script. People can Google it and find it. But one of my points I wanted to make is if there's 2 to 7 years wait for this diagnosis, and it's done in the UK by a questionnaire, effectively, a scored questionnaire, why do we have to wait for a psychiatrist to conduct it? That's my question, because I just think, should you pay if we were to pay for training of, say, a senior nurse or a GP in every surgery to have this knowledge, then we would probably reduce costs on the NHS of paying consultants for each of these diagnoses, as well as the cost to society of leaving people undiagnosed or waiting 2 to 7 years for that. And they're usually in crisis when they've been referred. They've got, you know, that's my main point. And before I go, I just really want to say thank you, because I'll be honest with you, I kind of, when I heard what you were going to do on this show, I actually, about 5 minutes after the call with the producer, kind of burst into tears with overwhelm of being able to tell people, have a voice. That's been my whole aim, is to give a voice to people that feel alone. A few more people can feel less alone. A few more people might find hope or solace from hearing your show. And a few people might hear it and realize that they aren't bad people or abnormal or failures. And they might feel a little bit better about themselves and seek diagnosis. Thank you so much, Nihal.
Brilliant.
It really means a lot. Thank you.
It's a great team here at 5 Live. And thank you, Chris, for insisting that we do this. Thank you very much indeed.
And great news about Spurs as well.
Yes.
We have someone coming in.
Yeah, that's true. Well, anyway. you shouldn't have said anything about Tottenham, because now people are going to think the only reason we got you on here is because you're a fellow Tottenham fan. Yeah, that's not the case. Chris Healey, thank you very much indeed.
Yes. Thanks a lot. Take care.
So many texts. been sat listening to your ADHD segment and now in tears of frustration. As a near 63-year-old, so much of what has been discussed explains my struggles over so many years. I've been successful in my life, but it's been so hard. All through my academic studies, I was regarded as someone with huge potential who never put in the effort needed to realise it. I'm now going to get a proper diagnosis and treatment. I've always believed it's never too late to get things sorted. Thank you for your programme today. That's from Kevin. Hi, I was diagnosed with adult ADHD at 50. It made me realise there was a reason I struggled with school all those years ago and with my adult working life. The diagnosis has changed my life. With the help I'm not getting, I feel I can achieve things. With the help I am getting, I feel I can achieve things that were out of my reach. I've had a successful career as an artist, but I think that has been down to loving parents who stood by me when I was young and my ability to fight on when the odds were stacked against me. ADHD and autism. Do social services need separate department handling them? I find staff have little concept of my difficulties, solutions. That's what Alistair said. Kerry in Cardiff said, great to hear your ADHD discussion. The label is the solution and the problem. It liberates you. You know that you are not unclever, mature enough and don't think deeply about things. But the label means you have to learn very quickly to advocate for yourself, which is a whole other level of work that will exhaust you. Being neurodiverse is exhausting. The battle to constantly keep up with non-neurodiverse individuals and their expectations is never spoken of. The exhaustion I feel on a daily basis from completing a day is debilitating. I can go on for so long and crash, and I'm crashing hard now. Your conversation is hopefully a beginning to get wider society to understand we don't work like you, but we can and do work very hard. Thank you for shedding light on ADHD in adulthood. As a father in my 40s, I share many of the characteristics discussed on your show, including a failed relationship some years ago and a misdiagnosis of depression during lockdown, which I initially put down to the stress of working increased hours at home. Having contacted my GP 6 months ago to discuss ADHD, I was sent for a blood test, although I didn't really understand why. I will be contacting my GP again to seek further help, as I can relate to so much of what you have been discussing. This other texter said, I'm somebody who has experienced most of the types of symptoms being discussed, but never thought to get a diagnosis, mainly on the basis of thinking what would actually change if I did. I'm lucky that on one hand, it made me pretty successful work-wise, but on reflection, probably at the same time, the way my mind works led to my divorce through lack of understanding and attention in that department, seeing some of the same traits in my children. I wonder if the panel can talk about what the diagnosis would actually change for anybody, especially given the amount of hassle it may well be to get one. Diagnosed at 32, was snowed with antidepressants throughout adulthood too. It's another texter. Hi Nihal. As a retired GP, I always thought of ADHD as the naughty child thing. Then I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, aged 56. I'm a high achiever, both professionally and athletically, but have always struggled with being normal mentally. I have a long history of depression and assumed most of my symptoms, inability to focus, concentrate, fidgety, and just an inability to function normally, were related to that, although a diagnosis of bipolar type 2 was also suggested. When ADHD was first suggested by my GP, I thought no way. An initial assessment was highly suggestive, so I just ignored that. I then had an online assessment by a GP specialist who himself suffers from ADHD, and my eyes were opened. To cut a long story shortish, I'm now on medication. My ability to concentrate and focus on simple tasks is 1,000,000 times better. My depression is much more stable, and I'm generally far more functional. Happily, my creativity and cheeky conversation are unchanged. I wish I'd known earlier, said Richard in Cumbria. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I never underestimate how brilliant it is that you would just spend so much time to write such a detailed text and send it into this show for the benefit of people that are listening.